And where praise Ramshaw, I'll explain that as we go along. But I thought of the title months before preparing the content of this talk. And there are two Ramshaws in the same county. This is but one of them. What follows is part family history, steeped in and shaped by Methodism, and vivid boyhood memories of Northumberland and Durham. And then finally, a very brief reflection on how this heritage informs our mission today. You'll be aware that recent presidents and vice presidents of conference have encouraged us to share our stories. Barbara Glasson and Clive Marsh did it in 2019, and this year, 2025, Richard Andrew, using Fanny Crosby's words, "This is my story." Each story is unique. Today's is a sort of kaleidoscope seen through the eyes and early life of one person. That's me. At the beginning of his magisterial, The English and Their History, Robert Toombs writes, "History assumes that, to some extent, the past explains the present. I've been hugely influenced by my distant past." In 1877, Mr. Emerson Bainbridge acquired Eshott Hall. Ruth, if we could have the first slide.
Sorry,
Ruth, can we have the first picture?
I'm sorry, I was taking off my jumper and had to take off my headset.
Oh, well, that's all right. You're comfortable again. There it is. It's an old country pile north of Morpeth in Northumberland, and Emerson Bainbridge acquired it as his family residence. It was he who founded the department store in Newcastle, which bore his name, now part of the John Lewis Partnership. Eshott Hall is now a hotel, and I've stayed there a few times in recent years. The Bainbridge family were devout Wesleyan Methodists, and Emerson built a chapel at the end of his drive in the tiny hamlet of Eshott. It was opened in 1882. Next slide, Ruth, please. There it is. It's now a community space. In recognition of the family's benevolence, the huge edifice on Heaton Road, Newcastle, opened in 1885, was named the Cuthbert Bainbridge Memorial Wesleyan Chapel after Emerson's son, though it became known simply as Bainbridge Memorial. Time permitting, we might come back to that. In the early 1900s, another of Emerson Bainbridge's sons, also named Emerson, was appointed the first manager of the colliery at Newbiggin by the Sea on the Northumberland coast, and he took up residence in one of the large properties on Front Street. The family needed a cook housekeeper. By some means, plausibly facilitated by the then Methodist Bush Telegraph, Anne Helena Dinning, a young woman from Gateshead, some 20 miles away, was hired and moved in. Meanwhile, Joseph Bell and his son William from Ashington had sailed to South Africa to seek their fortune. Joseph died suddenly on the first Christmas day that they were there, and William returned to Ashington to find employment in the local coal mines. I have here evidence, you'll realize how I've come to get this, of the fateful trip. If you can see that tiny little stone, well, I reckon that contains gold. Can you see it shining? And this fearsome thing, a dagger. There's its case. There's the dagger. I reckon this came from South Africa, and I inherited those from my dad. They are, I think, evidence of the aborted trip. Methodist connections somehow brought William Bell and Anne Helena Dinning together, and they married at Sunderland Road Primitive Methodist Church in Gateshead on the 1st of January 1912. What a day to have your wedding, New Year's Day. Eh? On the 30th of October 1912, their son Reuben was born at Zambezi House, Sheepwash Bank, Guidepost. Ruth, could we have the next slide, please? Now, if you look at the middle house of those three and look at the light above the white door, you may not be able to read it, but it contains the words Zambezi House. It's still there. If Sheepwash Bank Guidepost meant nothing to you, it's between Bedlington and Ashington. And I guess, there's no other explanation, is there, that the name of that house reflected the abortive South African trip. I sometimes wonder if the present occupants know why it was so named. Robert Thompson came from mid-County Durham. He sang baritone solos in Messiah. This is his copy. And as Margaret Doan may know, I've sung from it, not the solos. He'd be 19 at the time when he was given that. And the inscription on the inside reads, presented to Robert Thompson by the members of the West Cornforth Wesleyan Methodist Choir in appreciation of his services, December the 25th, Christmas Day, 1895. That copy is 130 years old. And the next slide shows the West Cornforth Wesleyan Methodist Chapel building. It's no longer a place of worship, but there it still stands. At some point, Robert Thompson moved to Pegswood in Northumberland, a few miles just east of Morpeth, where he met Florence Margaret Humphrey, the elder daughter of the colliery engineer. They married on the 5th of August, 1905, at the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Manchester Street in Morpeth. Their second and only surviving daughter, born June the 26th, 1909, was named Mary. And they, the family, attended Morpeth Road Wesleyan Methodist Church in Pegswood. It's still there, now a house. Next foil. Ruth, thank you. There it is, sideways on. You can imagine that was a Wesleyan Methodist chapel. But just around the corner, next foil, is Longhurst Road Primitive Methodist Church, still a place of worship. I don't know whether you can make out any of the words on the blue board on the front, but it's now a Methodist Anglican LEP, and it's known as St. Margaret's Chapel. We'll come back to that. The colliery engineer, James Edward Humphrey, my great-grandfather, as I'll explain, was the architect for Pegswood School, opened in 1904. And we'll see that on the next foil. It's still Pegswood County Primary School, and it was opened in 1908. You'll see, if you can remember the picture of the chapel on the previous foil, that the colour of the bricks is the same yellowish colour. Reuben Bell and Mary Thompson met through mutual Methodist friends, as we'll see in a moment, and were married in Morpeth Wesleyan Methodist Church in 1938. And I am their firstborn. I appeared in 1942. And I reflect that 55 years after my Grandad Bell married Anne Helena Dinning, a young lass from Gateshead, 55 years after that, I too married a young lass from Gateshead. History repeated itself. But I reflect that if great-granddad Joseph Bell hadn't died suddenly in South Africa, I wouldn't be here, would I? Well, the family home was at Newbiggin by the Sea. I was baptized and attended Sunday school at St Andrew's Wesleyan Methodist Church on the next file. There it is, it's still there. Another LEP. And I was privileged to preach there in 2006 during the year that I was vice president of the conference. One or two of you may know the next little anecdote. I got there at the end of January 2006, was greeted in the vestry by nobody that I knew particularly by then. And in came a man who introduced himself, and he had a gift bag. And he said, "There's a gift for you in there, and a family tree on which we both appear." It turned out he was John Robinson, and he was my second cousin, and I don't ever think I'd met him before. And he presented me with this gift. You may not be able to see it terribly well, but you can see that there's writing on it, and the writing says, "St Andrew's Methodist Church, Newbiggin by the Sea, 29th of January 2006, John Bell, Vice President of the Methodist Church and Conference." And John Robinson made that himself and engraved it. And there's an engraving on the, can you see the engraving there of the church? A beautiful thing. And dropped inside the vase was a little card. There's a little card. And it says, "A small gift to commemorate your homecoming." Well, there I was, 5 minutes before I was to lead worship at Newbiggin Methodist Church, presented with that. I had to pull myself together. My father's minister in Newbiggin was the Reverend John William Proud, whom I came to know as Uncle Bill, and his wife was Winnie, and they lived at the Newbiggin Manse at 14 Front Street, the same street as the former Bainbridge residence. Winnie was a teacher at Pegswood School and became a friend of Mary Thompson. The Prouds ran a Sunday evening youth group at Newbiggin Manse, attended by Reuben, and Winnie asked Mary if she'd like to come and help and make the tea. You can work the rest out for yourselves. A reflection on Methodist Union, if I may. This is a little digression. In Newbiggin and Pegswood, the Primitive Methodist Church in Newbiggin by the Sea was bombed out early in 1942 as the Luftwaffe dumped the last of their payload. There are varying stories as to how that came about. Did they get lost on the way home from Tyneside, or were they on their way home from Clydeside and still had a payload and thought, we'd better dump it somewhere? How about that nice little seaside place called Newbiggin? I might say, slightly tongue-in-cheek, Adolf Hitler was instrumental in Methodist Union in Newbiggin. Pegswood Wesleyan Methodist Church, where my family had attended, was forcibly closed by its minister amid much bitterness. Leslie, my mother's cousin, who still lived there and attended that church, never entered a Methodist church again in his life. So deep was the wound. But when my grandma Thompson, his aunt, died in Leeds, where we lived at the time and she lived with us, in 1966, we were to hold the funeral at Longhurst Road, Primitive Methodist Church, prior to her interment in the family grave in the village cemetery. And a sort of reconciliation was achieved, wasn't it? And remember, it was in the chapel which her father had designed 60 years before. And in August 1995, by chance, because I happened to know the minister in Morpeth, the Reverend Jeff Thomas, and happened to be in Northumberland for a few days at the time, I preached in that very same chapel. And this is the bit you can't make up, really, on the 50th anniversary of my granddad Thompson's death. Well, moving on, out of the RAF in 1945, my dad candidated for ministry and was sent to Hartley Victoria College in Manchester for 2 years ministerial training. As an aside, as Randall knows, Englesea Brook now has the college group photo for that period, 1945 to 47. I inherited it when my dad died, and I thought, well, nobody that is descending from me is going to be terribly interested in this. I can't think of anywhere better for it to go than Englesea Brook. And Randall said, oh, not another one, thank you very much, or was very grateful to receive it. And also, just as an aside, you have the Hartley Victoria College Old Students Association shield with a lot of little brass plates on, and very near the bottom is a brass plate with my name on it. Because I was, I think, the last but one president of the association and the only lay person, because Hartley Victoria College took lay students, and I lived there when I was a student in Manchester in the early 1960s. But as you work your way up the left-hand side of that wonderful shield, there are names on it that when I was a little boy, I held in awe. And then all those years later, I appeared at the bottom. All this is very humbling, isn't it? Anyway, Dad came out of college in mid 1947 and was stationed in the Consett circuit in northwest County Durham and to the Lead Gate section that had 8 churches. You know, they used to break probation and ministers in gently in those days, and he only got 8. Ledgate Front Street, which was Wesleyan, Ledgate Watling Street, which was primitive or had been, Iveston, Bradley Cottages, Derwent Cottages, Medimsley, Allendale Cottages, Wesley, and Allendale Cottages, West Road, which was primitive. The Medimsley I've mentioned is the Medimsley that's been in the news this week because of the terrible goings on at some sort of school institution for young men. And Dad made light of it. Well, he had a push bike, so he had nothing to complain about. Those of you that know Northwest Durham know that it's not exactly flat either, but he also had a venture bus timetable, and so could get to all of these places quite comfortably. None of them were far away. We lived in Ledgate. We attended Front Street, mostly. It's now a shop. We're on to the next foil, Ruth, if we may. There it is. I think it's a co-op, isn't it? I remember it well. Watling Street's now gone, but the 2 churches amalgamated in 1961, and they built a new church. You'll have to look this one up on the internet. I haven't got a photograph of it, but I was thrilled to be able to preach there in 2011 when they celebrated the golden anniversary of their new church building. And well, there were a few people there that I vaguely remembered, but it takes a little bit of imagination sometimes to recognize the boys and girls that you knew when you were 8, now that they're into their 60s. And some of them, you might say, well, you haven't changed. And some of them you don't recognize. Consett Circuit had tentacles into the North Pennine Moors, west of the A68 Roman switchback from Scotch Corner to Hadrian's Wall and the savages beyond. 3 of these churches were at Edmund Byers, Blanchland, and Ramshaw. We finally made Ramshaw. Ramshaw was an old lead mining community, and the road went and still goes no further. This is what I'm about to say. It's not a cynical comment, but we're talking about the days when the ministers made the plan. It was handwritten, and they planned themselves anywhere. They didn't sort of more or less confine themselves to their own sections. They used to go all around the circuit. And my dad, although we lived on the sort of northeastern edge of the circuit, occasionally got planned. By this time, Edmund Byres had closed, or shortly after. He got planted Blanchland and Ramshaw. Well, it may not sound very far now in the context of today's Methodist circuits, but Consett to Blanchland was 12 or 13 miles, and it was uphill and down dale. And it wasn't a push-bike job, and the venture bus didn't run on a Sunday afternoon. Question is, how did the preachers get to Blanchland and Ramshaw? Well, I'll tell you, because when I discovered how my father, when he was planned there, got there and back, I said to him, and I'm only 7 or 8 at the time, I said, Daddy, next time you go to those places, can I come with you? And he said, yes, of course you can. There'll be room for you in the car. Well, I'd never been in a car before because we didn't have one. And not many people did in those places at that time. So the arrangement was that this may not be the exact time, but let's call it 1:30. And let's forget Edmund Byres because it did close. The two preachers planned at Blanchland and Ramshaw had to be at Consett Marketplace at 1:30 on a Sunday afternoon, where they would be chauffeur driven to their appointments. And the car, it was always the same car, was an American Studebaker. And it had been left behind when the GIs went back home at the end of the Second World War. Whether or not this Studebaker had ever actually served the services in Consett, I never discovered. I don't know that there were any American bases anywhere near. At any rate, this taxi firm in Consett acquired this magnificent Studebaker. So on the next occasion, when my dad was either at Blanchland or Ramshaw, he said, well, would you like to come with us? I said, oh, yes, I will. So here I am, about 8 years old. We get the bus from Ledgate to Consett. There's the Studebaker in the marketplace. The other preacher is there, and somebody that my dad would know. And the two preachers said to themselves, well, we'll sit in the back. John can sit in the front with the driver. So I sat in the front of this Studebaker car and had this wonderful Sunday afternoon trip to either Blanchland or Ramshaw. And I remember it vividly. You know, it's not the sort of thing you easily forget, is it? I retraced my steps to these places last year, and I found Boltsburn Terrace. I think more or less, apart from a couple of farms, about the only surviving terrace in the old lead mining hamlet of Ramshaw. But let's stop on the way at Blanchland. And in fairly short order, Ruth, if you could show the next 3 slides. These are of Blanchland Wesleyan Methodist Church. It's a house now. Now, we've paused with that one. Can any of you read what's above the door? Wesleyan Providence Chapel, 1867. There it is. And then now we'll have the next one. And that's it from another angle. And I can remember going into that chapel. Now let's move on to Ramshaw. Ramshaw was a primitive Methodist church or chapel, if you'd rather call it that is dated 1877. So if we could do the same thing, Ruth, with the next 3 slides. That's Boltsburn Terrace, and the chapel is at the right-hand end of it. Next one. That's the same from the other end, as it were. There's the door. And the next one. And that says Primitive Methodist Chapel, 1877. Now, how do you get to Ramshaw Methodist Chapel? I remember this vividly from the first time I ever went, because the Studebaker car dropped off the preacher at Blanchland. I mean, you can work out that whoever was preaching at Blanchland could take his 40-minute sermon, because you had to wait for the Ramshaw one to finish and come back again. Anyway, moving on from Blanchland, we're now in Ramshaw, and the car stopped at the end of a track, and we got out, my dad and I. So if we could have the next picture, Ruth. Now that's looking down the track, and I remembered this with the dry stone wall on the right, and we walked down the track. Next one, Ruth. And then you walked sort of down a path there, and at the bottom of the path, you can see the building, which is the end of the chapel, right? Next one. And that's the view up the path you've just come down. And next one. And if you stand with your back to the chapel today, I took this last year, that's the view you get. Methodism was very strong, as you're familiar with, in all the Northumberland and Durham mining villages. They were established in every community because people had to walk to chapel. You may recall that in my vice presidential year, I encouraged people to reflect on the connections between church and work, faith and business, and I have a pit headgear motif on my preaching scarf, symbolic of my roots. For the Victorian Methodists, newly built chapels were deeply embedded in these burgeoning mining communities. That's why they built one at Ramshaw, though Ramshaw was lead mining, not coal mining. Nobody thought about a cost-benefit analysis or a long-term strategy. It was a no-brainer. Those who worked together in the lead mines Monday to Saturday worshipped with their families together on a Sunday. I'm going to read fairly quickly some words from a website that you can find if you want to look it up and look at it all. It's called Hunstanworth History. Hunstanworth, just literally spelt the way I said it, Hunstanworth History. And this bit is headed, Primitive Methodists found strength in their religion. Life for ordinary Hunstanworth families in the 1800s could be fraught with uncertainty. The men often dying in their 40s from decades of breathing in the dust of the mines. The women and children left behind to work even harder or depend on other family members to take them in. Right across the North Pennines, primitive Methodism gave people the spiritual resilience to endure whatever hardships came their way. What a tribute that is. And then a bit further down, I won't read the whole lot. Ramshaw's chapel roots run deeper than the 1877 commemorative stone plaque that you saw on the slide, on the building's front wall. According to Welland's Directory of 1856, might be Whelan's, a room close to the lead mines had been fitted out for worship 6 years earlier, and the Wesleyans and Primitive Methodists used it turn and turn about on alternate Sundays. Isn't that wonderful? Deary me. A Sunday school for the children also round there. And moving down a bit, this is really just to give you a flavour of how things were organised. In 1899, a letter to the Shotley Bridge circuit. Now, Shotley Bridge is on the way from Consett to Blanchland. That's where you cross the River Derwent until you come upon it again. Because Blanchland's actually in Northumberland because it's on that side of the River Derwent. In 1899, a letter to the Shotley Bridge circuit, it had its own circuit, complains bitterly that Ramshaw and Shildon, that was another lead mining community, are not getting their travelling preachers as promised. There now. In his letter, William Pears grudgingly concedes, he was the church council or the church secretary and treasurer and a member at Ramshaw. William Pears grudgingly concedes that the chapels have not always kept up their side of the bargain, which was footing the bill for the horse and trap. William born 1857, died 1945, only 3 or 4 years before I went to Ramshaw. Like his schoolmaster father, Thomas before him ran a general dealer's business, selling all manner of goods to the lead mining families round about. And then it says a bit more about him. A newspaper cutting from the Newcastle Journal in October 1957 is the final chapter in Ramshaw Chapel's history. The chapel is closing for the winter with only 6 in the congregation. Well, when I went in about 1948-49, there were only about 10. And 4 of them, 4 of the 6 members, are all the Miss Pears, the 4 spinster daughters of William Pears. And one of them, Annie Pears, who played the organ, I can remember, she says, when the chapel was packed. The lead mines were all going well in those days, and people would drive in by horse and trap from outlying places. If William Pears had been looking down on his daughter Annie at that point, he probably thought, I never did settle up for those travelling preachers. That's church treasurers for you. Mm-hmm. Now, just before we leave Ramshaw, I want to end the story of the Miss Pears. And if you've got very, very good memories of the 1963 bad winter, if you thought it was bad here, it was awful up in the northeast of England. And I quote again from Hunstanton with History. In January 1963, 3 elderly sisters, Minnie, Maud, and Annie Pears, found themselves freezing cold and unable to get out of their Ramshaw home because of the 20-feet-high snowdrifts that had made the valleys impassable. The local newspaper takes up the story. Policemen battled for 5 hours through terrific drifts to reach an isolated cottage at Ramshaw, where 3 aged spinsters had been isolated for days. 2 of the sisters, Minnie Pears, 74, and Maud, 66, were found alive, but their 88-year-old sister Annie was dead. 5 days earlier, the sisters had refused the advice of their doctor to go to hospital temporarily. The rescue party crawled along the snow-packed roads, and then, when it was impossible to go any further, borrowed a horse-drawn sledge from a farm, and this took them 3.5 miles over the fells. Then 9 local men manhandled the sledge another half-mile until it was possible to see the cottage, almost snow-covered. The 2 sisters were in an exhausted condition and were taken 8 miles by sledge to hospital. I remember reading that story in the national press in 1963. I was 21 at the time. And I remembered the names. And I remembered that Annie Pears, who died in the cottage, had played the organ. As an aside, that's the end of the Ramshaw bit. In 1994, as part of its privatization process, the British Coal Corporation was preparing to outsource its IT operations to the Phillips Company, of which I was the chief executive. At a meeting in Hobart House, London, the old NCB headquarters, with the British Coal Corporation's company secretary, Martin Shelton, I mentioned that both of my grandfathers had worked in the Northumberland collieries. One of them was Pegswood Colliery mason, and the other a winding engineman at Woodhorn, now the site of the mining museum. Out of the blue, not knowing anything about my history, Martin Shelton asked of the latter, was he a Wesleyan Methodist? It took my breath away, as you can imagine, and I confirmed that he was. But I had to ask, why the question, Martin? And the answer was, it was the one job in the pit where the men had to be stone cold sober when they reported for duty. and we could always rely on the Methodists. Another aside, if I may, we've got the time, I think. In 1951, so just a few years on, I'm 9 by this time, my father was stationed after concert in the Sunderland North Circuit with charge of Thompson Memorial Hall Methodist Church. It was built in 1904 so that the Thompson shipyard workers could attend Bible classes on Sunday afternoons and their wives' sisterhood meetings during the week. It seated 960, all wooden slatted tip-up seats. And I recall, without any understanding, particularly as a 12-year-old, my father announcing that the hall, as it was then known, was now on the Model Trust in 1954. It closed as a Methodist church in 1980 and is now a Chinese Christian place of worship. I'll tell you another little anecdote. I think I have the time. My dad served in that circuit for 5 years, and in 1978, when he retired from the active ministry, at the end of his 6-year stint as superintendent of the Stoke South Circuit, as it was then, he and my mother decided that their retirement home, a Methodist Ministers' Housing Society house, would be in Sunderland. And so he went back to Sunderland. During the time we were there, in 1950s, because of across the road from Thompson Memorial Hall was a confectioner tobacconist shop run by a man called John Tennick. John Tennick had connections with Sunderland Football Club that was literally just along the road from the manse where we lived. And my dad used to pop across there to get these pipe tobacco and would sometimes meet the Sunderland footballers because they'd come into the back shop, as it were, to get what they needed. And probably got it at a discount as well. Anyway, so my dad developed quite an affection for Sunderland Football Club, and he used to go every week, and I sometimes went with him and stand and bawl and shout on the terraces. We hadn't been there long. I think this was probably just literally the first autumn we were there. It came about that a member of one of my dad had one other church in the well-heeled village of Cleedon between Sunderland and South Shields. And a member, the husband of a member there died. I don't know that the man was a member. My dad took the funeral, however, at Cleedon Methodist Church and went to visit the widow a little while after. And on one of the visits, she said to him before he left, "Oh, Mr. Bell, I've got something for you." And she popped out of the room and came back and gave my dad the rest of the season ticket for Roker Park that her husband had used. And she said, "My husband knew that you were very interested in football and followed Sunderland, and I'm sure he would like to know that you were using his season ticket up." So my dad went and sat in the stand with this season ticket for the rest of the season. And at the end of the season, last home match, the men are saying, because they're all men, the men are saying, "Well, we'll see you in August, whenever the next season starts." And my dad said, "Well, I won't be up here, will I? Because you know why I happen to be here." Well, during the close season, and between the end of one season and the start of another, a man called Mr. Young called at our house to recover the stub of Mr. Rayside's season ticket, and he took it away. And a little while later, he came back, and he said, I was in the house at the time, he gave my dad an envelope, and he said, "That's for you." My dad opened the envelope. It was a whole season tickets worth of season tickets for the next season. Mr. Young's wife was the Queen Bee at Thompson Memorial Hall Sisterhood. And she'd said to her husband because he was one of the ones nearby in the stand, and she'd said to her husband at the end of the season, if you can afford a season ticket for yourself, you can buy one for my minister." Mr. Young didn't come to the church either. So for the next 4 years, my dad had a season ticket at Mr. Young's expense. That's why he always supported Sunderland to his dying day, and why, when we had his funeral service in Sunderland in 1990, I went to Marks and Spencer's and, much against my better judgment, bought a new red and white striped shirt to wear for the occasion. I've still got it, but I don't wear it anymore. Moving on rapidly, my lifetime has seen controversies since Methodist Union in 1932. Pegswood was but one, followed by inexorable decline and partnerships with other churches, as in Newbiggin and Pegswood. As for Ramshaw, of course, the chapel closed because lead mining stopped and the community was decimated. I touched earlier, right at the beginning, on Bainbridge Memorial in Newcastle. Just a couple of blocks away was Leighton Memorial Primitive Methodist Church, and along Heaton Road, less than a mile away, was Simonside United Methodist Church. That's where my dad was minister after we left Sunderland, so I know all these places fairly well. Over the years, they all closed. The three Methodist churches on Heaton Road all closed, and they formed a partnership with the URC, became known as St. Cuthbert's, and sadly, this year, that itself has closed. But for us, I suppose, we treasure our legacy. It may inform our mission today in the communities in which we live and work. If I might have the next slide, Ruth, that you recognized. And it's a plaque on a bridge over the Charles River in Boston, Massachusetts. And it's about the Bunker Hill Monument, which is just across the river and up the hill. And you may not be able to read the words, but the particular bit that, and Bunker Hill was the scene of a battle, as you may know, for the associated with American independence. It happened in 1775. And I noted the phrase on that plaque as I walked across the bridge just 2 months ago. And it said, "How the past informs our future." And my reflection is, well, it does not determine it, but we can be immensely inspired by the faithfulness, excuse me, the faithfulness and commitment of those that have gone before us. Thanks be to God for the Pears Sisters of Ramshaw and many others like them. Finally, in very quick order, Ruth, the three images. The first one, and I'm quoting the words of Godfrey Thring in his hymn, "Leaving All Behind Us." Next one. The words of Maria Willis, "The Rocks Along Our Way." That's at Newport, Rhode Island. And Godfrey Thring again, "May we hasten on, even if we wistfully glance backwards from time to time in thanksgiving." That's me done. Amen.